Good evening, everyone. My name is Hannah Burling. I'm with the League of Women Voters of New Mexico. And tonight, we're very lucky to have Senator Fred Harris with us. And before we start, I just want to tell you that in the bottom bar of your screen is a Q&A box, and that is where you can write in questions, which Dick Mason, the chair of our action committee, will be asking Senator Harris at the end of his talk. Okay. So, Senator Harris is a widely published author. He's a professor emeritus of political science at the University of New Mexico, where he continues some teaching in the UNM Fred Harris Congressional Internship Program. He was twice elected US Senator from Oklahoma as a progressive and reform-minded senator, and he is the only surviving member of the Kerner Commission. He was a Fulbright Scholar in Mexico, a visiting professor at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. He's taught and lectured throughout Latin America, Europe, Asia, and he's produced 20 nonfiction books on politics, government, and policy, including Healing Our Divided Nation, a 50th anniversary update of the Kerner Report. So now, here's Senator Harris.
Thank you, Hannah. These are serious times, of course, and I'm glad that the League of Women Voters has brought us together virtually to discuss some of the issues that are before us. We all witnessed the horrible murder of George Floyd. It made us sick at heart. We're deeply grieved, and we're mad as hell. And we're impressed, I am, by the millions of Americans who came out on the streets to protest. And they came back again and again. It's been about 2 weeks now, day after day. I, as Hannah said, am the lone surviving member of the Kerner Commission, which issued a report after the terrible riots and disorders, violent disorders, which occurred in about 25 or more cities throughout the country in the what was called the long, hot summer of 1967, with the enormous number of deaths, most of them of Black people, most of them innocent of any wrongdoing, terrible human injury, and great property damage. The President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, appointed a Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission, of which I, of course, was a member, called us together by telegram in the presence of in the cabinet room in the White House and in the presence of the Vice President, the Attorney General, a number of other important government officials. And it was a very serious occasion. The President gave us our charge. He said, I want you to find out with these riots and disorders which had occurred, what happened, why did they happen, and what can we do to keep them from happening again and again. This commission was appointed partly at my suggestion, not just to look into the law and order aspects of the riots and disorders, but also at basic causes and to make recommendations in regard to them. We, after 20 days of hearings, people like from J. Edgar Hoover to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and then going out in the country as teams to the riot cities. I was on a team with just me and Mayor John Lindsay, and we later were a team in leading the activities and the findings and recommendations of the Kerner Commission. We came back from those trips to the riot cities, talking to people there on the streets and otherwise. And after getting a great number of very serious studies of what had occurred and why it had occurred, we said quite frankly that the basic cause of these terrible disorders and riots was white racism and desperate poverty. People were living, black people in the cities throughout the country, in terrible conditions of inferior housing, almost criminally inferior schools, no jobs, no housing that was suitable, and very, very desperate poverty, plus enormous hostility, correctly or justified hostility at the police, and the police brutality which had occurred through so many years and with so many black people in America. The most famous finding or statement in our 1968 report was, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And we said straight out, the president told us to find the truth and express it in your report. And that's what we did. We said that white racism was the cause of the creation of these black ghettos throughout the country. And it was white racism which had kept those ghettos alive and the people there in desperate poverty. We recommended then great new federal programs for jobs, for education, training, for health, for housing, and for integration of the housing and schools of the country. And we also recommended various serious reforms of the police. We said the police ought to look like the communities where they were sent to, quote, protect and serve. They ought to be a part of the community, and they ought to reflect the values of our country. There should be no militarization of the police. We made progress. Civil rights was in the air. We'd passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. Civil rights was in the air. There was a majority of Democrats in the Congress for doing something about racism and poverty. Even with the election, after the election of President Richard Nixon, on a kind of law, or after a law and order campaign. So we were making real progress on desegregation. We were notably narrowing the black-white achievement gap in education. And had that rate of the disappearance of that black-white achievement gap continued at the same level, we wouldn't have any achievement gap between blacks and whites in schools today in America. There was a great increase in the numbers of black elected officials and of African Americans and Latinos who entered into the middle class and into virtually every aspect of American life. And then what happened? Well, good jobs in the country began to disappear altogether or to leave the country. Politics and government, finally with the law and order campaign, began to take a serious conservative turn. And then the courts turned their back on civil rights and on African Americans. Congress too. Congress cut taxes for the rich and the big corporations and cut programs which had been intended for the benefit of middle class and poor people. So at about the end of nearly 10 years, progress in the fight against racism and poverty stopped, and then it reversed. And that's been the trend since the late 1970s, and it's the situation again today. The schools and housing in the country are all rapidly resegregating, locking in African Americans and Latinos into terrible slums and their children into inferior schools. The inequality of wealth and income has worsened, and it's worsened even more lately with the terrible COVID-19 onslaught. So where are we now? Well, we're all appalled that still far too much excessive force by the police, too often deadly force, especially against African Americans. And white supremacists have become bolder and more violent. Housing and schools have been, as I said, notably resegregating. And the total number of poor people in the country, while the rate of poverty in the country has stayed stubbornly the same, with population growth, there are millions more people who are poor in this country today than there were in 1968. As a matter of fact, there are 143 million Americans today living in poverty or in low income brackets. And the inequality of wealth and income is worse than it's ever been, and it's been made worse even more by COVID-19, especially for minority people, for people of color, and for poor people. So where do we go from here? First of all, we've got to keep the memory of George Floyd and many others like him in our hearts. And also keep in our hearts the memory of the more than 116,000 people who are dead because of COVID-19, so many of whom, unfortunately, would have been saved by timely federal action. And I think we have to vow, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. And furthermore, and importantly, we have to stay mad as hell a little longer, to November at least, and our government. And when we change our government, we know what needs to be done, and we know what works. Basically, we could start out and get nearly everywhere we want to go by following the Kerner Commission recommendations on racism, inequity, and inequality of wealth and income. And we should make trade-offs, cut the military, for example, and increase early childhood education. Change the culture and training of the police. They ought to be demilitarized and made more the faithful representatives of our better selves. I take heart from the proposals in the Congress and at the local level for reform of the police. We need to reform them, reform their practices to make them more legal and humane and transparent and more subject to real civilian control and oversight. We're making some steps in that direction, but they're very first steps. I'm encouraged too by the discussion of what's called defunding the police, which I take to mean at least reinvestment in Black and Latino communities and reallocation of resources to social services and community-based strategies and civilian crisis responders. What we've done is we put on the police a lot of these problems like homelessness and domestic violence and mental health problems and so forth. And when there's a call or trouble in the school with some troublesome youth, we've been sending out armed police. When what we need with them, maybe, or alone, but with them, crisis responders who are experts in those fields and know how to de-escalate a tense and potentially violent situation rather than to escalate it. No, we don't need more militarization of any kind, and we don't need more polarization. What I think we do need is what I call communitization. There's an enhanced role for civil society here. Every community in America ought to have a representative commission to work together on these problems. Not to study the problems, we've studied them to death, but to act locally. We've got a chance right now, I think, maybe the last chance, to get this right. And I've got increased hope that we will. It's my informed judgment that the majority of Americans are ready to do what needs to be done. I see more progressive activism in this country today than ever before in my lifetime. And like new organizations, great new organizations and efforts like the Women's March and Indivisible and Black Lives Matter and the Poor People's Campaign. And right now, today, these demonstrators and protesters, I take heart too from how they're different from the people who went into the streets in the violent disorders and riots of 1967. These are multi-ethnic, multiracial. They cut across race lines. They're white, they're black. They cut across all sorts of lines, economic class lines, gender lines, age lines. That's really, I think, very encouraging. And these protests and demonstrations today are really different too, because they're much longer lasting. And they're much more widely based. And they, I think, are already having enormous impact. And I think will continue to do so if the rest of us back them. I say as often as I can that what we ought to do is follow the advice and words of what I think is one of the great people in America today, Reverend William Barber of North Carolina, who's head of the Poor People's Campaign, that's going to have a virtual march, it's virtual now, march on Washington later on this month. I think he's dead right when he says, we can't keep fighting in our silos. No more separating issues, he says, over here, voting rights over there. He says, the same people fighting one should have to fight all of us together. And I say to you, if white, black, Latino, Native American, Asian Pacific Island, and other Americans join hands in dedicated coalition with each other now, and with women, millennials, seniors, the LGBTQ community, immigrants, for our common interests, and our interests are common. The declaration of George Floyd's brothers at his Houston funeral service, they said, George Floyd is going to change the world. That prediction, you and I can help make come true and make it possible for every human being in this country to say with assurance, I can breathe. Thank you.
All right. No. Let's see.
I'm open for
Okay. Are you finished, Fred?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to be sure. We have a quick question from Nandini. What do you think we can do about the power of police unions to stop progress?
Well, we got that problem right here in Albuquerque. I was just appalled by the fact that when the president of the city council here in Albuquerque Pat Davis made a proposal for how to change the police and the practices of the police, the head of the police union, talking about a member of the city council, president of the city council, said that that proposal was ignorant and I believe outrageous, idiotic, he said. It was idiotic. Well, I'm a union man. This country needs more unions and more union activity, and I want to make it easier for unions to be formed. But we've got to change, and that includes changing the way the police operate and changing what the police do. As I said, we need them to have equal, fully funded partners who are trained in mental health and in domestic violence and in what to do about homelessness and so forth. That's really not, police were putting too much work on them.
Okay. I do encourage other people to ask questions. Here's one. What makes this period of concern about racism different from past periods?
Well, you know, I think we made a mistake in the Kerner Commission. Well, let me say another big difference between what happened with those riots and violent disorders in 1967 and today. Today, there have been far, far less violence. There was some violence, particularly at the first, but my own judgment is a big part of it was from people who were outsiders who had different agendas from the great bulk of the millions of other protesters and demonstrators. Well, what's different is those were the typical person taking place in those disorders in '67 was a young black male of about 25 or under. And here you've got whites and blacks and all sorts of people. It's a really diverse and represented group of demonstrators. Furthermore, we made a mistake, as I started to say, in the Kerner Commission. In our hearings, for example, they were closed hearings. We just never thought about it. We didn't have them open. We should have. And we should have taken people with us, the press particularly, as we run around the country and looked at these riots on the ground, what had happened and why they'd happened and so forth, so that when we finished up, the people of the country would have been able to see what we'd seen, this desperate poverty, the terrible brutality that had been suffered by these black residents from the police. My father was a small farmer in southwestern Oklahoma, and he loved me, of course, but the way he heard what we said in the Kerner report was, Mr. Harris, out of the goodness of your heart, you ought to pay more taxes in order to help poor black people who are rioting in Detroit. He didn't realize that what we said right out loud, what we're saying doesn't just apply to black people. We're talking about people urban and rural, black and white, as we said in those days, Spanish surname, Native Americans and every other minority. And here, this time, people have been able to see with their own eyes. They saw that horrible murder of a man crying out to his mother, saying, I cannot breathe, I'm gonna die. We saw that with our own eyes. And that has made us see more and more, I think, the problems of racism and poverty, which have plagued our country forever. And I think has built a greater will to try to do something about it and about the police and how they operate.
Thank you. We have a question from Susie, thanking you for your time and insight, but wanting to better understand what went wrong in the 1970s that the progress that you helped kickstart in 1968 did not sustain.
Well, first of all, President Johnson, he had told us to let it. I'm kind of laughing because when he called me up and said, I'm gonna appoint that commission that you've been talking about, and I'm gonna put you on it. And I said, well, I didn't expect that, but I'll do the best I can. He said, now I want you to remember that you're a Johnson man. And I said, yes, sir, I am a Johnson man. He said, if you forget it, I'll take my pocket knife and cut your blank off. And he did not say blank. Johnson told us to tell the truth, and that's what we did. And he was misinformed about what we were doing on the commission and what we recommended. And a member of Congress we know told him, said, this commission report is going to ruin you. It doesn't have a good word to say about anything you've done on racism and poverty. And it condones riots and encourages riots. And so he rejected our report. He later came around some, but nevertheless, it was supported, strongly supported by a lot of people and by the country. And we made progress for a while until sort of the law and order began to take the stage.
Okay. Okay, from David Burling, this is a tough one. How do you change the minds of people who are racist and threatened by the change and who will oppose vehemently any changes with integration in schools and housing?
It is hard to communicate with a lot of people who disagree with what I've just said because their sources of information are different. And it makes it tough to get our message across and help people to see the facts. But that's what I think we're more and more doing. And that's what has happened here lately with the murder of George Floyd. And we've got these lapel cameras. We ought to require them everywhere of sheriff's departments and the police departments so that we get a chance to see what happened. For example, when that Buffalo police pushed down that 75-year-old demonstrator and he cracked his skull, and they went along without trying to help him at first. They first said, oh, well, he fell. But we had a lapel camera which told us what the truth was. And that's a big change. I think Americans, I think even people that disagree with me, for example, and the things I believe in, I think they would say, well, I'm not a racist. And I think what we have to make clear to people is that we're not talking about just where one white person hates black people. We're talking about systemic racism in this country and the terrible poverty that so many people live in. We just drive past those places where they live and things are all right with us. And too long we've been able to keep from having that on our conscience. But that's becoming harder and harder to do. And I think it's programs like this with the League of Women Voters and others that are beginning to show other people what it is. We're not attacking white people. We're saying white people, we have to look at ourselves. There's enough fault here to go around. I grew up in a small town of about 1,500 people in southwestern Oklahoma. No black people lived there. And when I went to the University of Oklahoma in 1948 in Norman, Oklahoma, no black person lived in Norman. In my hometown of Walters, Oklahoma, I think that the reason no black people lived there was that some years ago they'd passed what was called a sundown ordinance, so that no black person could stay all night even, much less live in Walters. At any rate, there weren't any black people. What I say is, with that kind of background, I grew up in the, I was living my own Grapes of Wrath movie as a youngster. I grew up in the days of the Dust Bowl and Depression. And if I can come to see what I've come to see, I think anybody can. But we've got to help everybody see it.
Thank you. And again, I want to remind people to use the question and answer. We're getting quite a few though, so that's great. This is from Mary. How do you think that the fact that the world is responding to the Floyd murder will help the situation? Or will it?
I think it maybe worries some people that maybe at first wouldn't have agreed with me and the kind of things that I'm talking about. But you know, we all believe in our country, and we want our country to be a leader in the world, and and now we see that people see us, so many people around the world see us as a bad example. I think that hurts us a little bit to know that, and maybe it makes us a little more motivated to change things, to come back again to be a leader of the world.
Thank you. Stephen asked a question, how do you feel that reform can take place within the police force when it seems that racism currently plagues these systems so perversely? Policies can be enacted, of course, but whether or not they are upheld by the individuals in our police force and justice system is another question entirely. Whoa.
Well, now first of all, we ought not to paint with a broad brush and condemn all of the police, but there isn't often the wrong kind of culture and the wrong kind of training and the wrong kind of rules and regulations and laws in regard to what is legal and proper in the way of use of force. We began to change that in the country after the recommendations of the Kerner report. We moved more toward community policing. What our recommendations were adopted and approved by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. But then community policing and the changes began to drop, primarily, I think, for supposed budget problems. And then the federal government began to push all sorts of military equipment on the police departments. They became more and more militarized. But back in those days, I spent a night one time with the U.S. attorney in the Bronx, in a precinct in the Bronx, just walking around looking what's going on. And that precinct house, which we first met in, had a big plaque up in it that called itself Fort Apache. They felt like they were just totally embattled and surrounded. They were all white. They all lived, the police there, and then they all lived outside the precinct, and they came in during the day to really enforce the law against the community, rather than looking like the other members of the community and being a part of the community and really being there to protect and serve. Well, all that greatly changed. And then with President Obama, you know, we had passed earlier a law, Congress had, which allowed the Department of Justice to take over control of police departments for improper use of force regularly and repeatedly. And so the Department of Justice under Obama took control of the police departments in a number of cities, a rather large number of cities, including Albuquerque. And all of that and the kinds of changes that were made toward more humane and legal operations in the police, all of that was pushed away, stopped once the president came into office.
Thank you. From Sharon, my concern is that the movement will be hijacked by anarchists and driven off the rail by white supremacists. This movement doesn't have a spokesperson. Is that necessary to keep it focused and so that the message doesn't get lost?
Well, that worried me, not Antifa, but I was worried that politicians from top on down would do what Nixon did back in the 60s and 70s, and that is run for office and campaign on law and order. We've got to stop this violence and so forth, and they'd go up in the polls. That did happen a little right at first, because we did have some violence right at first. We said on the Kerner Commission, we strongly condemned violence as a tactic. We said it doesn't work. It doesn't bring justice. It brings greater repression. And that is absolutely true. But we've had far less violence. And as I said, is right at the first, and we've got to keep people's focus on these peaceful demonstrations and protests, but more than that, on what's behind it. Not only to reform the police, that's not going to be enough. We've got to eliminate, for once and for all, the outward results and effects of racism and eliminate poverty. We can do that. We've in a sense made a decision just by inaction or by indecision in favor of racism and poverty. We've got to make not just say, well, we don't support racism. We've got to be anti-racist and we've got to be anti-poverty, active.
Thank you. So Lily has a question. How much does the rising awareness about the disparate access to treatment and health outcomes during this pandemic contribute to the conditions for social unrest and demonstrations with the Black Lives Matters and their supporters?
That's a very good point. I think a lot of people have learned for the first time how necessary it is for us, if we're going to have a stable society of self-esteem, how necessary it is for us to have health care for everybody. And we see that, I've said to a group that I have breakfast with, or used to, now do but on Zoom, I've made a vow that I am not going to look for a job in a meatpacking plant. I'm not going to go to a nursing home or prison, and I'm not going to turn poor. And because as we've seen, it's those places, and it's particularly for people of color and for poor people, that COVID-19 has hit so hard, and or the hardest. And therefore, I think people have begun to see that. I think there's more support than ever for universal health care.
Okay, thank you. Kathleen asked, you mentioned the present great surge in progressive activism. What are your observations on whether those progressive voices are being heeded at the national level?
Well, we're going to have to change our government. That's, people are going to have to, as I said, we're mad as hell, most of us, and we've got to stay mad as hell. Back when all this great activism really got started so well was the day after the presidential inauguration with the Women's March. And a lot of people said, well, yeah, that's pretty impressive, but, will it last? Well, it's not only last, but it's grown. And it's given rise to other kinds of organizations like Indivisible, for example, and this wonderful grassroots organization. Everything, all the real changes of any consequence that have happened in this country didn't start at the top. They started at the bottom. The women's movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and Occupy Wall Street, and so forth. And that's what I see. And it's not only continuing, it's getting larger. And just as these protests and demonstrations have been getting larger, particularly with additional killings, senseless killings by the police. For example, in Atlanta just so lately.
Thank you. Eileen asks, what are some respectful ways that white allies might interrupt or address oppression when we see it?
Well, we've got to change ourselves. And I think one of the big, I'll just tell you this, for example. When I was living in practicing law in Lawton, straight out of law school, Lawton, Oklahoma was a third largest city in Oklahoma. It's down in southwest Oklahoma. My then wife, LaDonna Harris, member of the Comanche Indian tribe, as are our 3 children, enrolled members of the Comanche Indian tribe. She and I supported her, and so did a lot of other people, formed a thing that they just finally kind of called the group. They became more and more aware, we became more and more aware of Black people were having to sit in the galleries in the movie houses, and they couldn't get jobs in any of the stores, and they couldn't eat in the local restaurants and so forth. And this was before the civil rights law, for example, in '64. And so they started, she started, and I also assisted with it, called a thing called the group, a black group, a group of black citizens there in Lawton, and a group of whites would meet in a home, 1 week in a white home, one in a black home, every week, and just socializing. It started out without any agendas, and they'd have a friendly drink and then eat together, have supper. And the first thing you know, they began to say, somebody said, well, did you know that J.C. Penney's won't hire a black person? We were fortunate in that we had right next door Fort Sill, the military post, and the commander, in a situation like that where black people couldn't get into a restaurant, he was willing to put the restaurant on off limits so that soldiers couldn't go there or go into J.C. Penney's. And that began to make some real changes. And what was so important is that we each became real friends of each other. We knew each other. And that's why I say, for example, in your Rotary Club or in the League of Women Voters or in whatever organization you belong to, in your church, there ought to be people who are different from you, both ethnically or racially, but also in other ways. And not just one sort of token or two, but more than that. And that's why I said, I think we ought to have in every community a commission like that group we had in Lawton, Oklahoma, where we get to know each other. We see that we have the same hopes and dreams and fears. We're the same kind of human beings. And I think that that's really important. And we come to know a good deal more about the lives of each other. And I think we're all basically good people. We all are social animals. And I think most of us grow up feeling that, as a motto I learned years ago, the best work of life is service to others. And I think that would help us change. But basically, what can white people do? We have to change ourselves.
Thank you. Marcy asked, and you've addressed this somewhat, but you come from a background similar to many people who are on the opposite side of these issues. What made you different?
You know, I don't know. I've wondered about that myself. For example, when I was in high school, I took one semester of speech and so forth. And one exercise we had to have was to take some speech from Shakespeare and recite it, from memory to the class. I chose the speech of Shylock from the Merchant of Venice, but I changed the words. It said, Shylock said, if you prick a Jew, won't he bleed? And so forth. Aren't Jews just like the rest of us, basically? I don't know if I even knew what a Jew was then, but I later learned, and I learned how so many had been discriminated against and died in the Holocaust and so forth. But I did know that about black people and how they were mistreated. And so I changed that speech of Shylock, and I said, if you prick a Negro, won't he bleed? I made my whole speech that. I think I somehow took to heart Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, that all men are created equal, and somehow first wanted to put it in practice. I grew up among the Comanche Indians. They were scattered all throughout our county, and we all went to school together. And I eventually married, as I said, a Comanche Indian. I don't know of anybody at that time who had done that. But we ourselves, my folks, for example, we were without a home back in the Depression when I was about 4 years old. And we moved into the home of a Comanche Indian family, the Cushawans. Later, Mabel Jean, one of a daughter, and I were in school together. But that was, I think, rather unusual. But they took us in, and we shared their home for a while until we were able to get a home of our own. They had a home, we did not.
Okay. Going back a little history, you mentioned how your report was received by LBJ, not getting fully behind the report. What do you think were the factors and why he did not get behind it?
Well, we know this. John Lindsay and I pretty much ran that Kerner Commission. There's a book about that came in 2018 called Separate and Unequal, written by Dr. Stephen Gillen, who gives the whole background of how the Kerner Commission operated. And I didn't know until later with his book and research that all the time, John and I, we were pressing the commission to go the way we thought they ought to go on findings and on recommendations. That there were some commissioners that were reporting to Lyndon Johnson, the president, that Fred Harris and John Lindsay are just going too far, too fast, and so forth. We had some tough votes, for example, on whether we were going to use the word racism. No government agency had ever used that. There were some members who said, more conservative members of our commission who said, well, shouldn't we say intolerance or discrimination? And I said, I think it's important. We thought it was important to use the word racism, to say it right out loud. That was the truth. And that was a vote of 6-5. Also a vote, Lyndon Johnson thought that there was a conspiracy behind these riots and disorders back then, that they were organized and that they were agitators like H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael were stirring up these riots. I met with him at the White House one day, just me and him, and I tried to disabuse him of that. I said, Mr. President, the conditions where these people live are so awful, and the hostility to the police is so rightly very, very high, that almost any spark could set off these riots, and that's what occurred. And the spark was the police in every instance. That's what set them off. Johnson, I never convinced him. And he was feeling, I think, very embattled by the demonstrators against the Vietnam War at that time. He was misinformed about what the commission was to report. And that's really sad, I think, because President Johnson did more against racism and poverty than any president before or since.
Thank you. Okay, this comes from David. What are your views on the possibility of some form of reparations to Black and Native American communities?
I think we're going to have to do it. I don't know how you know, this terrible sin and scourge of slavery. When slavery was finally abolished, Abraham Lincoln, a man of the law, couldn't figure out a constitutional way to abolish slavery, though he thought it was an evil institution, until he came to this idea. Well, let's say that these slaves are an asset for the Confederacy that's fighting against us. So what he did was to free the slaves in the Confederate states, in the states that had seceded. and he called them contraband. And he figured out a legal way, a constitutional way he could do that, because, you know, the Constitution had really sort of enshrined slavery, and we'd compromised on it forever. Then after the war, they pushed through the constitutional amendment which abolished slavery, and there was a strong feeling in the Congress at that time, led by the New England abolitionists in particular, that they ought to have a Freedmen's Bureau, which they then set up to try to see that these people, the former slaves, did really become full citizens. But later the compromises were made, and the Freedmen's Bureau was allowed, it was toothless anyway, to die. But also there was the idea that every head of a slave household, or a household of a former slave, would receive a mule and 40 acres of land. That wasn't much, but they didn't have any property, no way to make a living, because they hadn't been property themselves. And there was a strong feeling that they ought to push education. That had been illegal in the southern states. And all of that was a false promise. It never occurred. Compromises politically were made, and the country turned its back on those former slaves. So they've inherited all that terrible baggage of slavery, and that's real. It's very real, and we've got to do something. I'm so glad that people are talking about let's really appoint a commission and get down to this question of reparations. We've got to somehow give compensatory attention to the needs of people who've been discriminated against and grown up in this terrible poverty. People like that, these kids in so many of these black sections, Latino sections of the country, they have zero chance to ever rise out of it. I went to the university, I went to all public schools, and the schools were good. And not only that, but they were virtually free. I mean, through law school. For example, my first semester at the University of Oklahoma, the tuition, the whole tuition for the semester was $48, virtually free. Well, my grandson can't do that. And if my grandson can't do that these days, first of all, you can't get a job while going to school that pays enough to pay the tuition. That tuition has gone sky high. If my grandson can't do that, think how it is for black children, black young people, Latino, Native American young people who start out with such a terrible handicap.
Okay, from Rachel, what about the fact that in the past commissions and attempts at police reform have not resulted in lasting change in terms of reducing violence and death?
That's what everybody says. First of all, when the Kerner Commission was appointed back in 1967, it looked like a middle-class group, and they said, well, nothing good will ever come of that. And they were as surprised as President Johnson was that did not turn out to be true. But also, there were people that said at the time, there have been recommendations before and nothing's going to come of it. A lot did come of it, but unfortunately, that didn't last. This time, I have a feeling that something's different. Just to take a look at the makeup of these demonstrators, as I said. Back then, the people that were in the streets were young black men, 25 and under. Now it's just a very diverse group that's really representative of the country. And they keep coming back day after day. I don't know how long they're going to keep coming back, but this is not going to go away, I don't think. And I believe, as we've already begun to see, politicians even those who are not going to go nearly in the direction or as far as we want them to go in Congress, even they are introducing proposals for police reform. It's coming, and I believe that we ought to keep the pressure on.
Okay. Thank you. This is the last question, sort of related to the reparations questions. Would a Truth and Reconciliation Commission do any good?
Well, yes. You know, that's one of the things that I think we could do with these local commissions that I'm talking about, private. There's a role for civil society. I don't think we need to make it a government agency. I don't see why you couldn't, in a church or in a club or whatever, set up some kind of a joint and diverse representative group that would really study and look at and talk about these issues and conditions, and in the process get to know one another, see their own personal interest in this. What you got to talk to a person like my dad was? You got to say to him, Mr. Harris, you're right. You are paying too much tax, you're not getting the proper benefits. There was no health care program then for him and people like him. And we ought to see our common interests in these issues. That's what Reverend William, suddenly it just skips me, the head of the Poor People's Campaign has made clear. That's what we've got to do, is to see that we're all in this together. And as I like to say, Reverend Barber, William Barber, as I like to say, everybody does better when everybody does better.
Thank you. That is the last question. Hannah, Senator, do you want to make a final statement? And then I'll turn it back. I'll mute myself and turn it back to Hannah.
Well, let me just say this. In these last few days, I can't tell you how many interviews I've had and how many appearances I'm making, which is to tell you how much interest there is, how concerned people are, and how many people are concerned. That is a very encouraging thing. I think we ought to support the virtual March on Washington by Reverend William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign. We ought to back whatever organizations we believe in, like Black Lives Matter or Indivisible or whatever. We ought to vote. We ought to remember to vote and talk to all these demonstrators and protesters about voting too. We do that, we ourselves can have a lot of influence on the outcome of all this mess.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Harris. I want you to know that your audience is vigorously, though virtually, applauding. And thank you to everyone who participated this evening. And I'd especially like to say thank you for holding out hope to us in this really painful period in our country's history. Okay. Good night, all.
Good night.